It was a Wednesday evening, 7:43 p.m., and the dinner table was set for 3. Marcus and their daughter Lily, 7 years old, were already seated. Elena was still in the kitchen, finishing the last pan, listening to them talk about something that had happened at school, something about a frog, something that made Marcus laugh in that specific way he only laughed with Lily now. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had not heard directed at her in longer than she could accurately remember. She stood at the stove for a moment with the serving spoon in her hand and did not move, not because she was busy, because she was listening to that laugh and feeling something she could not immediately name, not quite grief, not quite anger, something older than both, something that had been sitting in the kitchen with her for years, quiet and patient, waiting for her to finally stop moving long enough to notice it. She was 41 years old, married to Marcus for 13 years, a graphic designer who worked from home, which meant she was always there, always available, always present, always the one who knew where Lily's shoes were and when the dentist appointment was and what Marcus preferred for dinner on nights when he came home already depleted from the office. She had become, over 13 years, extraordinarily good at anticipating needs, and somewhere in the process of becoming that good at it, she had stopped asking whether her own needs were being anticipated in return. She walked to the table with the serving dish, sat down, smiled at Lily, and said nothing about the laugh. If something in that image feels familiar, not the specific details but the specific quality of invisibility inside a life that looks, from the outside, completely fine, I want you to stay with me, because what I am going to share today is not about blame. It is not about making your partner the villain of your story. It is about something far more precise and far more useful. Understanding the invisible curriculum you have been teaching inside your marriage, the one you wrote without knowing you were writing it, and how to change the lesson before the course ends permanently. If this is your first time here, I want to invite you to subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel exists for the conversations that most people are having alone, in kitchens at 7:43 p.m., in cars after difficult evenings, in the specific silence of lying next to someone and feeling the distance between you as a physical thing. You do not have to navigate this without language for it. That is why this exists. Carl Jung said that everything that is not made conscious appears in our life as fate, and in marriage, nowhere is this more true than in the dynamics we allow to calcify without ever consciously choosing them. The way he stopped asking how your day was, the way you stopped telling him, the way requests became demands, became silence, became distance. None of it was decided, all of it was taught. And here is the thing about lessons taught unconsciously. They can be retaught, but only once you understand what you have been communicating. Epictetus, born into slavery and later one of the most influential minds in Stoic philosophy, spent his entire life examining one central question. What is actually within our power, and what are we wasting our lives trying to control that was never ours to begin with? He answered it with unusual simplicity. Our judgments, our intentions, our responses, these are ours. The behavior of everyone around us, including the person we married, this is not. And the moment we confuse those two categories, we begin the specific kind of suffering that Elena had been living inside for years, trying to earn through performance what can only be given freely. Elena had been performing for 13 years, not dishonestly, not strategically, performing in the way that anxiously attached people perform, with genuine love underneath, genuine effort, genuine belief that If she could just be consistent enough, available enough, low maintenance enough, the connection she was hungry for would eventually materialize. She cooked the dinners he preferred. She managed the household logistics without complaint. She swallowed needs that felt too large or too inconvenient. She laughed at the right moments and stayed quiet at the moments when her instinct was to speak, because speaking felt risky and silence felt safe. And somewhere along the way, safe had become her highest aspiration inside the marriage. And in doing all of this, in being so extraordinarily careful and so systematically self-erasing, she had taught Marcus something she never intended to teach him: that she did not require much, that she would be there regardless, that her presence was guaranteed, and therefore her needs were optional. Not because Marcus was cruel, because she had written that lesson into every interaction for 13 years, and Marcus, like all of us, had simply learned what he was taught. This is the pattern I see most consistently in my clinical work with couples, not the dramatic dysfunction of betrayal or open contempt, the quiet dysfunction of one person, sometimes both, who learned early that love was conditional, that needs were burdens, that the safest way to stay connected to someone important was to become as undemanding as possible, and who carried that strategy, developed in childhood, directly into the adult relationship where it was not only unnecessary but actively corrosive. John Bowlby, whose work on attachment theory remains one of the most clinically significant contributions to relationship psychology, described this pattern with precision. The child who grows up with an emotionally inconsistent caregiver, warm sometimes, unavailable others, loving in ways that feel contingent on the child's behavior, develops what he called anxious attachment, a nervous system organized around the perpetual question of whether the attachment figure will be there, and the strategy this child develops to manage that question is preemptive accommodation. Become less, need less, make yourself easier to love, because the alternative, being fully yourself with full needs and risking the withdrawal of affection, feels existentially dangerous. Elena's mother had been a beautiful, complicated woman who loved her genuinely and inconsistently. There were evenings of real warmth and evenings of cold withdrawal that Elena could never predict or explain, so she had learned by approximately age 8 to read the emotional weather of a room before she entered it, to calibrate her needs to whatever capacity was available, to be the child who did not add to the difficulty. She had been so good at this that her mother had once said proudly to a family friend, "Elena never causes problems, she just fits in." Elena had felt at the time that this was a compliment. She understood only much later that it was a description of a child who had learned to disappear. That child was still in Elena's kitchen on Wednesday evening at 7:43 p.m., still reading the emotional weather, still calibrating, still teaching the lesson she had never meant to teach. But there is something even deeper underneath this pattern that most discussions of relationship dynamics never reach. And this is where it matters to be precise, because the precision is what makes change possible rather than just comprehensible. The lesson Elena was teaching was not simply, "I don't need much." The lesson was more specific than that and more damaging. The lesson was, "My feelings are not important enough to interrupt the comfort of this room. My needs are not legitimate enough to risk a moment of tension. My presence in this marriage is conditional on my usefulness. And the moment I stop being useful, stop being the one who manages, anticipates, accommodates, I will lose what little connection remains." This is not a belief Elena had chosen. It was a conclusion her nervous system had reached based on decades of accumulated evidence, beginning long before Marcos existed. Bessel van der Kolk writes that the body keeps the score, that the experiences of early emotional life do not remain as memories in the mind, but migrate into the body as states, as reflexes, as the automatic tightening that happens before conscious thought has even registered that something is occurring. Elena did not think her way into preemptive self-erasure. Her body performed it before her mind could intervene. And this is the moment of absolution I want to offer you directly. The thing I say to almost every person who sits across from me and describes some version of Elena's story. You are not weak. You are not broken. You are not, as some people have told themselves in the privacy of 3 a.m., fundamentally unlovable. You are a person whose nervous system learned an extraordinarily sophisticated strategy to survive an environment where full presence felt dangerous. The strategy worked then. It is destroying you now. Those are two different facts, and both are true simultaneously. The Stoics understood this, though they lacked the neurobiological language to articulate it in the way we can today. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, not for an audience but for himself, as a daily practice of honest self-examination, that the first task of a disciplined mind is to see clearly, not to judge, not to react, to see. And what he meant by seeing clearly was precisely the capacity Elena had not yet developed inside her marriage, the ability to look at what is actually happening rather than what she had decided, unconsciously and years ago, that it meant. What was actually happening was this. Marcus had become comfortable in a way that was slowly killing the marriage. Not maliciously, not intentionally. He had simply learned from the curriculum Elena had been teaching for 13 years that she would not require discomfort from him, that she would absorb difficulty without naming it, that the marriage could coast on logistics and shared parenting and the occasional genuine evening of connection without anyone being asked to go deeper. He had learned this because she had taught it, and he was, as all of us are, a faithful student of what he was shown. Epictetus said, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." This sounds, taken out of context, like resignation. It is the opposite. It is the most radical form of honesty available, the willingness to stop arguing with what is, to see it with complete clarity, so that the response can come from that clarity rather than from the distorted lens of what we wish were true. Elena had been arguing with reality for years, not out loud, internally, silently, in the way that people who have learned not to cause problems argue, by hoping, by telling herself that the disconnection was temporary, that he was just stressed, that things would naturally return to what they had been in the early years when he still reached for her in the dark. She had been so committed to this hope that she had not been able to see the more uncomfortable truth. The disconnection was not temporary. It was a structure. It had been built incrementally from thousands of small decisions, most of them hers, to prioritize the surface over the depth, the peace of the room over the health of the relationship. Talvez isso esteja acontecendo no seu casamento agora. Not the dramatic version, not the version with raised voices or obvious contempt, the quiet version, the version where everything functions and nothing connects, where the children are cared for and the bills are paid and the calendar is full, and yet at 7:43 on a Wednesday evening, you are standing in your own kitchen feeling like a stranger in a life you built. If you recognize that feeling, I want to point you towards something I created specifically for this work. The patterns we are describing, anxious attachment, preemptive self-erasure, the slow curriculum of disconnection, these do not resolve through understanding alone. Understanding is the beginning. The reconstruction requires structure, a method that takes you from recognition to actual change, step by step, with exercises that address not just the thinking, but the body's deeply held patterns. That is what my ebook, The Shadow of Marriage, was built for. It is not a collection of tips. It is a clinical framework for the specific work of changing what you have been teaching. Inside yourself first, and then inside the relationship. The link is in the description. If what you are hearing today is landing somewhere real, that book is the next step. But before we talk about how to change the lesson, we need to understand with precision what the lesson currently is. Because most people who are living Elena's pattern have a significant blind spot. They believe they are being loving. They are. But they have confused love with self-abandonment. They have confused accommodation with generosity. They have confused the absence of conflict with the presence of peace. And these confusions are not small. They are the entire architecture of the problem. Here is what I want you to sit with before we continue. Think about the last time you needed something from your partner. Something emotional, something specific, something that felt important. And you decided not to ask for it. Not because the moment was wrong, not because you had genuinely considered it and decided to let it go, but because asking felt too risky. Because you had already, in the split second before the thought was fully formed, predicted the response and found it insufficient and decided that the pain of asking and being met with emptiness was worse than the pain of simply not asking. That prediction, that fast, automatic, below-language prediction, is the curriculum. That is the lesson you are teaching. Every time you swallow a need before it can be voiced, you are communicating to your partner. This need does not deserve space in our relationship. And every time you communicate that, your partner learns it. And every time your partner learns it, the lesson becomes harder to unteach. Esse é o ponto onde tudo pode mudar. Not through a dramatic confrontation. Not through an ultimatum that comes from the accumulated frustration of years of unspoken needs finally reaching a boiling point. But through the slow, deliberate, Stoic practice of rewriting the curriculum. One interaction at a time, one voiced need at a time, one moment of staying present in the discomfort of being seen, rather than retreating into the safety of invisibility. This is what the Stoic philosophers meant when they talked about virtue as a practice rather than a state. Not something you achieve and then possess, something you choose repeatedly in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life until the choosing becomes the person you are. Marcus Aurelius did not become the philosopher-emperor through a single insight. He became him through thousands of daily returns to the same questions. What am I actually doing? What am I actually choosing? Who am I actually being in this moment? And is it the person I intend to be? Elena had not been asking those questions. She had been surviving. And survival, over 13 years, had become indistinguishable from the life itself. The turning point came not in the kitchen on Wednesday, but 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, when Lily was at a birthday party and the house was quiet in a way that felt different from the usual quiet. Not the quiet of people moving around each other, but the quiet of two people with nowhere to be and no task to complete and no child to organize themselves around. They were in the kitchen together, separately, Marcus reading something on his phone and Elena with coffee going cold in her hand, and she became suddenly acutely aware of how practiced they had both become at being in the same room without being present to each other. She sat with that awareness for a long moment, and then she said quietly, without planning it, without the careful calibration she usually applied to every word she directed at him, "I miss you. I don't know when that happened, but I miss you, and I'm sitting 3 feet away from you." Marcus looked up from his phone slowly, not defensively, not with the particular quality of guardedness that had become his default response to anything that felt like it might require emotional effort. He looked up the way people look up when something unexpected has cut through the noise, with a kind of startled presence, like a person who has been somewhere else for a long time and has suddenly, without warning, been returned to the room. He did not say anything immediately. Elena watched him and did not fill the silence. This was new. The old version of her would have already retreated, would have softened the statement with a laugh, would have added, "Never mind, it's nothing," would have done whatever was necessary to reduce the temperature of the moment back to the manageable coolness that had become their baseline. But she had made a decision, somewhere between Wednesday at 7:43 p.m. and this Saturday morning, that she was no longer willing to be the one who made things easier at the cost of making them false. So she waited, and Marcus said, after what felt like a very long time but was probably 40 seconds, "I didn't know you felt that way." 4 words that contained, Elena realized, the entire architecture of what had gone wrong. Not "I don't care," not "I disagree," "I didn't know," because she had never told him, because she had been so committed to the performance of not needing, so practiced at anticipating and absorbing and accommodating, that the person sitting 3 feet away from her for 13 years had been learning faithfully and consistently that she was fine, that she didn't need, that the marriage was functioning at the level she required. He had been a perfect student of a curriculum she had never meant to write. This is the moment I want to examine carefully, because it contains the most important clinical insight I can offer about what it actually means to teach people how to treat you, and more importantly, how to change what you have been teaching. Because Elena's story reaches its turning point not in the dramatic confrontation that years of accumulated distance might suggest was necessary, but in this ordinary Saturday morning moment of simply saying a true thing without immediately taking it back. The Stoics called this parrhesia, fearless speech or frank speech, the willingness to say the true thing regardless of its reception. Epictetus taught it as a form of self-respect, the understanding that when you consistently say less than what is true, you are not protecting the relationship. You are eroding it. You are teaching the other person that your interior life is not available for genuine contact. And eventually, both of you begin to live in the gap between what is real and what is said, and that gap becomes the marriage itself. Elena had been living in that gap for years, and the gap had a specific texture that I recognize immediately in clinical work. It feels like loneliness that cannot be named as loneliness because the person is not alone. It feels like grief that cannot be named as grief because nothing has been lost in any obvious way. It feels like hunger for something that is technically present but somehow inaccessible, like standing outside a warm room with your face against the glass. The reason it is so difficult to name is that naming it requires acknowledging something deeply uncomfortable, that the disconnection is not only something that happened to you, it is something you participated in creating, not because you are bad or weak or unworthy of connection, but because you brought into the marriage a set of strategies developed long before Marcus, tested and refined in the emotional laboratory of your childhood, that were designed for a different environment, strategies that prioritize connection through self-erasure over connection through self-disclosure, strategies that confuse being needed with being loved, strategies that your nervous system still runs as the default operating system, even when the original threat that generated them no longer exists. Jung called this the shadow, not evil, not darkness in a moral sense, but the unexamined, the part of the self that operates below consciousness, governing behavior through patterns so familiar they no longer feel like choices, they feel like personality. They feel like, this is just how I am. And the shadow in a marriage is particularly insidious because it is invisible to both partners simultaneously. Elena did not know she was performing. Marcus did not know he was being taught. They were both inside a dynamic that neither of them had consciously created and neither of them fully understood, and they were both, in their own way, suffering inside it. Making the shadow conscious, seeing the pattern clearly enough to name it, is not comfortable. It is, in fact, one of the most uncomfortable things a person can do inside a long marriage, because it requires sitting with the recognition that the suffering was not only inflicted upon you, it was also, in part, constructed by you. And that recognition carries with it a specific quality of grief that has no clean resolution. The grief of years spent in a pattern that you would have chosen differently if you had known what you were choosing. But here is what that grief also carries: agency. If the lesson was taught, it can be retaught. If the curriculum was written, it can be revised. If the pattern was learned, it can be unlearned. Not instantly, not without difficulty, not without the specific courage that Seneca was describing when he wrote that a gem cannot be polished without friction, but it can be done, and the doing of it begins not with a dramatic overhaul of the relationship, but with the smallest possible unit of change. One true thing said without immediately taking it back. That Saturday morning, Elena had said one true thing, and Marcus had heard it. And what happened next is what I want to describe carefully, because it contains the second most important insight about changing the lesson, and it is the insight that most people miss because they are so focused on their own change that they forget that the other person is also inside a pattern, also shaped by history, also carrying a shadow that governs behavior from below consciousness. Marcus did not respond to Elena's statement with the warmth and immediate availability that she had, in her most private hopes, imagined. He responded with something more honest and ultimately more useful: visible discomfort. He set his phone down. He looked at the table. He said, "I feel like I've been failing you for a long time, and I didn't know how to fix it, so I stopped trying. This is the climax that I referenced earlier, the moment that comes not from the person you expected, but from the one who has been quietly carrying their own version of the same wound." Because Marcus had not been emotionally absent from the marriage, because he did not love Elena. He had been absent because he had learned, from a father who expressed love through provision and problem solving, and never once through vulnerability, that emotional presence was not something men were equipped to offer. That feelings were burdens to be managed privately. That the appropriate response to a wife who seemed fine was to leave her fine and not introduce complexity. He had brought his own shadow into the marriage, his own childhood curriculum, his own set of strategies developed in an environment where emotional needs were treated as inconveniences, and those strategies had collided with Elena's strategies in the specific, terrible way that Bowlby's attachment theory predicts with uncomfortable accuracy. The anxiously attached person and the avoidantly attached person find each other with an almost magnetic consistency because each confirms the other's deepest fear. She feared she was too much. He feared he was not enough. And they had spent 13 years in perfect unconscious collaboration, proving both fears simultaneously true. This is what almost no one tells you about teaching people how to treat you. You are not teaching in isolation. You are co-authoring a curriculum with someone who arrived with their own lesson plan. And changing what you teach requires not only looking at your own patterns, but developing enough compassion for theirs to understand that their failure to meet you was not a verdict on your worth. It was a reflection of their own limitation, a limitation that is real, that has real consequences, and that is also not permanent. The second practice I want to give you is what Marcus Aurelius called amor fati, love of fate, or more precisely, the willingness to accept what is as the starting point for what can be, rather than spending your energy in the exhausting argument with how things should have been different. This is not resignation. This is the most radical form of forward motion available, seeing the reality of what your marriage has become without minimizing it and without catastrophizing it, as the raw material from which something different can be built. Elena could have responded to Marcus's statement, "I stopped trying," with the accumulated hurt of 13 years, with the list of unmet needs and unanswered bids for connection, and Wednesday evenings at 7:43 p.m. when she stood in the kitchen listening to a laugh she no longer received. She could have, and part of her wanted to, because that hurt was real and it deserved acknowledgement. But she had been learning in the weeks between Wednesday and Saturday something the Stoics understood that most modern relationship advice misses entirely. The goal of a difficult conversation is not to win it. It is not even to be fully understood in it. The goal is to stay present inside the discomfort long enough for something true to become visible to both people simultaneously. And that requires the specific discipline of choosing your response rather than simply having it, of finding, in the fraction of a second between what he said and what you could say, the response that serves the relationship rather than the one that serves the wound. She said, "I know. I think I made it easy for you to stop trying. I think I was so afraid of needing too much that I stopped letting you know what I needed at all." This is what changing the lesson looks like in practice. Not a declaration of new boundaries, not an ultimatum, a revision of the curriculum in real time, a moment in which she took responsibility for her part of the pattern without taking responsibility for his, acknowledged her contribution to the dynamic without absolving either of them of the work that the dynamic now required. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and then he said something that she would think about for weeks afterward. He said, "I've been waiting for you to need me, not for logistics, for something real. And every time I thought you were okay, I felt more like I was failing you by not knowing what you actually needed." Esse é o ponto onde tudo pode mudar. Because what that statement revealed was not a marriage in which one person had been absent and one person had been abandoned. It revealed a marriage in which two people had been separately, silently, suffering from the same wound, the specific wound of feeling unseen by the person who was supposed to see you most clearly. He had been waiting to be needed. She had been afraid to need. And they had been missing each other perfectly for 13 years. The third practice and the one that the original Stoic philosophers returned to most consistently, is what Seneca called the daily examination. Every evening he would review the day not with judgment but with honest inquiry. Where did I act from my values, and where did I act from fear? Where did I choose consciously, and where did I simply react? Where did I teach the lesson I intended to teach, and where did the old curriculum run without my awareness? Applied to a marriage, this practice looks different than most people expect. It is not a conversation you have with your partner. It is a conversation you have with yourself privately at the end of the day, about the specific moments in which you had the opportunity to be present and visible and honest, and what you chose instead, not to punish yourself for the moments you retreated, to understand them, to see with the clarity that Epictetus was describing what was actually happening in that moment and what it would have required to respond differently. Elena began this practice on the Sunday after the Saturday morning conversation. She sat in the quiet of the bedroom while Marcus was in the shower, and she reviewed the day, not the whole day, just the moments that had felt charged, the moments where she had felt the familiar tightening that preceded self-erasure. There had been 3, one in the morning when he had made a comment about the grocery list that she had interpreted as criticism and swallowed without responding. One in the afternoon when Lily had asked them to play a board game and she had watched Marcus engage with Lily with more warmth than he typically directed at her, and had felt briefly the specific ache of that observation before moving past it. And one in the evening when he had asked what she wanted to do after Lily's bedtime, and she had said, "Whatever you want," when the true answer was more specific and more vulnerable, and more likely to lead to a real evening rather than another night of parallel presence. 3 moments, 3 small choices to retreat rather than remain, 3 entries in a curriculum she was trying to revise. She did not beat herself for any of them, she simply noted them. And in noting them, she began to develop something that I consider the most essential capacity for this work, the ability to see the pattern clearly enough to catch it slightly earlier each time, not to eliminate it immediately, not to transform overnight into a person who needs without apology and speaks without self-censorship, but to shorten the distance between the impulse to retreat and the conscious choice to stay, until eventually that distance becomes the pause, and the pause becomes the space in which a different lesson can be taught. This is what I want to point you toward as the practical core of everything we have discussed today. The change does not happen in the dramatic conversations, though those conversations are necessary and important. The change happens in the accumulation of small moments in which you choose, incrementally and imperfectly and with genuine courage, to let yourself be seen, to voice the need before you have already decided it will not be met, to stay in the discomfort of an unresolved moment instead of smoothing it into the false peace of accommodation. If you want structure for this work, a method that takes you through it step by step with exercises designed specifically for the patterns we have been describing today, my ebook, The Shadow of Marriage, was written for exactly this moment, the moment after the recognition when you understand what has been happening but need more than understanding to actually change it, when you need a map, not just a mirror. The link is in the description. It is for people who are ready to do the work of rewriting the curriculum, inside themselves first, and then inside the relationship. By the end of March, 6 weeks after the Saturday morning conversation, Elena and Marcus were not a transformed couple in the way that inspirational content promises transformation. They were something more modest and more real. They were two people who had begun, carefully and awkwardly and with frequent backsliding, to tell each other the truth. Marcus had started asking on some evenings what she actually needed, not what was convenient, but what was real. Elena had started answering sometimes before she had already decided the answer was too much to ask for. They had one conversation in early April on a Tuesday night after Lily was asleep that lasted 2.5 hours and covered ground they had not touched in a decade, not because they had learned the right techniques, because they had both, separately and then together, decided that the gap between what was real and what was said had become more painful than the discomfort of closing it. That decision, to close the gap, to revise the curriculum, to teach something different, even when the old lesson ran so deep it felt like personality, is not a single moment. It is a daily practice. It is the most stoic thing available to anyone inside a marriage that has drifted. The willingness to return every day to the question of who you are actually being and whether that person is teaching what you intend. You teach people how to treat you in every interaction, in what you ask for and what you swallow, in what you name and what you allow to remain invisible, in the moments you stay present in discomfort and the moments you retreat into the safety of accommodation. The lesson is being delivered constantly, whether you are aware of it or not. The question is not whether you are teaching. The question is whether you are teaching consciously. Marcus Aurelius returned to this question every morning of his life, not because he had resolved it, because it required returning to. Because the gap between the person we intend to be and the person we are in the ordinary, unchosen moments of an ordinary day is the exact width of the work, and the work is never finished. It is only ever continued or abandoned. Elena did not abandon it. And on a Wednesday evening in late April, same table, same hour, same daughter talking about something that had happened at school, Marcus laughed at something Lily said and then, without transition, looked across the table at Elena and said it again, just to her, just because she was there. She did not stand in the kitchen listening to a laugh she could not access. She was in it. She had made herself available for it by making herself visible to it, by revising, one small moment at a time, the curriculum that had kept her 3 feet away from her own life. That is what changing the lesson looks like, not dramatic, not instant, incremental, deliberate, and in the end, entirely worth the difficulty of the work. Carl Jung said that everything that is not made conscious appears in our life as fate. The lesson you have been teaching was unconscious. Now it is not, and that difference between fate and choice, between pattern and intention, between the shadow and the light, is the entire distance between the marriage you have been living and the one that is still possible. If you want a structured path through that distance, the shadow of marriage is in the description. And if this video reached something real in you today, I want to invite you to leave a comment. Not a reaction, but a reflection. What is one thing you have been swallowing in your marriage that deserves to be said? You do not have to answer to me, but write it down. Let it exist in language, even here, even for a moment. Because the lesson begins changing the moment the truth becomes visible, even to only one person, even if that person is only you. Subscribe if you have not already. Every week this channel brings clinical depth to the conversations most people are having in silence. You do not have to figure this out without language for it. Your story does not have to end in the shadow. It begins changing the moment you decide to teach something different. And that moment, that specific, ordinary, entirely available moment is now.